Welcome back to Fresh Outlook, everybody. President Barack Obama proposes a 10-year budget that analysts say stabilizes the federal deficit, but does not seek balance. Instead, it focuses on policies to address income inequality or redistribution of wealth, as he adds nearly $6 trillion to the debt. Let's say hello to the Fresh Outlook think tank. I am joined by Matt Tyrmand. He is a healthcare portfolio manager, and he runs a website called openbooks.com. I am also joined by Professor Bill Rodgers. He is the chief economist of the Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rodgers. And I'm also joined by Dr. Vince Aletto, who is a board-certified ER doc. He's the guy you want to see if you're in a jam. Okay, let's turn first to Bill. Bill, tell me about the budget. When I hear budgets and spending plans, even as a journalist, I kind of like nod off like a lot of Americans do. So what's this budget all about? It's instead of just 1 year, it's 10 years. And I also don't think he's passed a budget ever, has he?
Well,
I asked you 9 questions there. I take them as you
I mean, President Obama, I think this is a budget that I think he would have liked to have put in place or advanced when he was first elected in the first term. When I worked on his transition committee, one of our committees at the Department of Labor, our mantra was around sort of restoring some of the gains that workers had been losing and families had been losing over the last basically 2 to 3 decades because of rising income inequality. But as we know, because of the Great Recession and the slow jobs recovery we've had, job one was to just sort of get the economy, save the economy.
Exactly.
And so this budget is really, to me, is a statement of his values, finally showing out that he really does care about these long-term structural problems, this growth in income inequality that is now seeped up into the middle class. He calls it middle class economics. I call it Alice economics, where here in New Jersey we've sort of created this household family called Alice, called Asset Limited Income Constrained and Employed. And these are families who live in our communities, about a third of our New Jersey communities, households that can't make ends meet because of the kinds of jobs that they're in, because of the strain that they're facing in terms of their child care, health care.
So how does this budget help them? Does it help them by lowering their taxes? Does it help them by giving them credits?
Exactly.
How would all those things?
Yes, yeah. So he's coined this phrase middle class economics, which is about taxing a higher part of the income scale and using those funds to pay for a child care credit, to pay for investments in education, investments in training, because again, the big framework here is around trying to do what the United Nations calls, and that's invest in human priorities expenditures. And some research that I've done over the last few years has shown whenever we've slowed down our investments in human priorities, education, training, households in terms of helping their child care, investing in communities and libraries, investing in our infrastructure, we've seen income inequality rise. So it's his first budget to really try to get at these big issues.
Okay, now here's the problem I have. We've heard this talk now for 6 years. We've heard about shovel-ready jobs. We've heard about $1 trillion investment in our country. And I don't know, I drive down the roads seem like they're falling apart. The jobs that are created seem like they're largely created by the private sector, and the wealth that's created seems like it's created by the private sector. So there's a lot of people out there like me who don't have a lot of faith in the government to level the playing field other than the government just getting out of the way.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, the sort of wild, wild west approach doesn't work. Back in the 1980s, when we had significant economic growth, we grew and the pie got bigger, but that's one of those periods where income inequality got worsened. And why was it worsened? It was because of conscious policy decisions that had less focus on investing in these human priority expenditures that the United Nations so focuses on. While in the 1990s expansion, from 1992 to 2001, there we had the pie growing. We had the pie growing, but it was growing, yes, because the government did get out of the way, but the government also provided incentives for individuals to invest in themselves. It provided incentives and programs and opportunities such as raising the minimum wage, expanding the earned income tax credit, which is supported by Republicans. But these were all policies that distinguished the 1990s growth to the 1980s growth. 1990s, we grew, the pie grew, but we grew together because we made conscious decisions like this budget is trying to do.
Matt Tyrmand's going to tell me that we grew in the early 90s because it had been set up by 8 years of President Reagan.
I would agree.
I would tell you that, reading your mind. A
Yeah.
big part of this budget is healthcare. And healthcare costs, according to some estimates, that Obamacare is actually not going to be as expensive as they thought. But that's because fewer people, many fewer people than they thought, are actually enrolling in it. Talk to me about Obamacare and its implications for the budget.
Well, the whole idea behind Obamacare, the idea that was sold to the American public, was if we bring more people onto the insurance rolls, we will drive down the per unit cost. And at the same time, you would bend the cost curve on the consumption side. So by having more people consuming, you would then have an embedded economy of scale taking hold. But what they failed to do in Obamacare, and after reading the 2,500-page document in 2009, where it was contradiction after contradiction, was that costs were obviously going to go up because there was no clarity on delivery mechanisms. There was no innovation. There was one good component of Obamacare, which was they were going to put a lot of money into healthcare information technology, healthcare IT, and that was going to regulate data, would keep it consistent, compatible, and easily transferable so that everything would be mechanized and people would, all the practitioners and deliverers would have access to this data, and then you'd have better expected outcomes because you'd have more information at your fingertips. That was a $10 billion part of a $1 trillion program. And what we've seen now 5 years in is that most of those high-tech act potential beneficiaries in doctors' offices have not actually embraced healthcare IT because this thing was slapped together in a way that there was no strong incentives built in. It was just, we'll throw money at it, and if we build it, so to speak, they will come. They haven't.
I'm going to hold you there. Vince, you're on the front lines of this. Mm-hmm. People come into your ER and they're sick. Some have health insurance, some don't.
Yes.
A friend of mine works as a doctor in Massachusetts where they have universal health care. He said before universal health care, about 80% of the people had health insurance. After universal health care, about 80% of the people had health insurance. People aren't necessarily, getting Obamacare because they don't want Obamacare, it seems. Is that your experience, that there's not really much of a change in the numbers?
Yes. In the ER, we still see this, we see a lot more people who are uninsured since we had this fiscal debacle back in 2007. A lot of people did lose their insurance, but we've always had a steady number of people who do not. I think that statistic is always going to be that statistic. People don't get it for whatever reason. They don't want it. They're too lazy. They can't afford it. There's always going to be a percentage of people who don't have insurance.
Bill, I know this gets your goat because I know you worked with the transition team. You're interested in Obamacare. And I really do think this was the road to heck that was paved with good intentions because there were supposedly 45 million people who needed health care. How come, they're not knocking down the door to get it? Because you can get subsidies, you can get onto Medicaid. I mean, there's lots of ways to access health insurance now.
Yeah, I think for the viewers, I think the big point to kind of pull away from this is, it's good to focus on the cost, but I think there's so many times when we get in these conversations, particularly we started the segment off about the budget. We're in this sort of framework, this conversation, the dialogue is around we can't afford it.
As a government, as a people, as a public.
Exactly. When we need to focus on the benefits. One of my first sort of policy experiences was being on a school board. And one of the phrases that I was taught early on by some of my senior colleagues was, let's build a budget of need. And when we have these conversations where we just so focus on the cost sides of things, and we focus on, we can't afford it, when we're losing sight of that like for the Obamacare piece, this is trying to address healthcare issues that have become public health problems. Right? Your earlier segment about measles, right? That's a perfect example of, here you have a healthcare issue that's now become a public health problem. And so when we have these conversations, we need to make sure that we're having both sides of that ledger being talked about, because otherwise, and the president he even loses his footing when he gets caught up and pulled into the whole, we can't afford.
Part of the problem is to many people it's un-American. It smacks of European socialism to have all these policies where money is taken from one group, given to another group, redistributed, everybody gets everything, let's level the playing field. What people like about America is the fact that you can work your tail off, you can get ahead, you can become an overnight sensation, and that might not happen to most people, but it happens to some people, and that's enough to drive that American dream.
Yeah, but the one problem I think is there's been a number of studies that have been coming up and been produced that have seemed to suggest that the ability for individuals to sort of progress and move up the income scale, like you've said, that's become much harder because we have basically sort of pulled back on our investments in these human priorities, such as investments in education, investments in training, helping families and communities respond to a superstorm Sandy and be able to move faster. I mean, we're basically at a fork in the road right now where we've sown the seeds for another growth in inequality, and I think the way we have to sort of respond to this is what we do with the United Way, where we have broken up. We talk about Alice, his family, and we talk about these are the direct effects to Alice, but we're also trying to show people this is how Alice, when she has substandard housing, affects all of us in this room.
Absolutely. We've got to hold you there just because we're running out of time. When we return, we're going to talk about the FCC and their new role and their powerful new rules in protecting the internet when we come back.